With Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth back with you on America's Forum. Miranda, one of the battles we used to fight in Congress from western states trying to explain how much of our land was basically in federal hands because of prior arrangements.
It's a lot bigger than most people realize, right?
It is huge. For example, in Idaho, over 60% of that state's land is owned by the federal government.
Well, and that land includes national forests, parks, wildlife reserves, and it includes over 83,000 acres.
And so Idahoans are saying, now wait a minute. Certainly some of that land could be in our hands instead of that of Uncle Sam. Let's go further in depth on this, as we are pleased to be joined by a man who believes that changes will benefit Idaho and Idahoans. He is Fred Birnbaum. Fred is the vice president for the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Fred, you've written an article on this subject. Sum up your article and the arguments you make for Idahoans being in charge of Idaho's land.
Well, thank you for having me, JD. The argument is very simple. At the opening, you alluded to the fact that over 60% of Idaho is federal land. And our state right now, our livelihoods are being impacted by federal policies, which have reduced logging on federal lands, for example, by 90% from their peak. And currently, Idaho's per capita income is one of the lowest among the 50 states. And one of the reasons for that is that the federal lands that are controlled by the Forest Service and the BLM are not used currently very much for either timber harvest, mining, or traditional things like grazing. They are used for those activities, but it's at a much reduced rate compared to the past, and that's really impacting rural communities. And I wanted to point this out because the president and others talk about the lack of middle-class prosperity, and this is a key piece of the puzzle for people who live in Idaho.
So, Fred, why would the federal government, what does the federal government gain actually by keeping control of this land and not giving it back to the states?
Well, it's an old issue and it's a long issue, and I think I want to distinguish the ownership piece from the management piece. The fact that the federal government owns it is not necessarily the issue. The issue is that the federal government is managing it in a way that constrains the economic vitality of the land. So, for example, if the federal government allowed more timber harvests, we would have more prosperity, we'd have fewer forest fires, for example. The state wouldn't necessarily have to own it. And the Property and Environment Research Center of Montana actually spelled out in a report that Idaho and Arizona and Montana, as well as New Mexico, have state lands. And these state lands are managed in a much better way from a revenue cost efficiency standpoint than the federal lands. So my primary point writing the article was to point out that there is a better path forward for managing these federal lands, even if the federal government retains ownership. Now, if they were to transfer them to the state has a current framework for managing lands because the state of Idaho owns over 2 million lands and manages them much better than the federal government.
And with about a minute left, Fred, since you say the issue is essentially management rather than ownership, do Idahoans regard Uncle Sam as a friend or a foe when it comes to managing those lands?
Well, I would say the Idahoans in rural areas would certainly say that the federal government now is a foe. And I do want to make one point of clarification. If the federal government won't better manage the lands, we would like to take them back. I just wanted to point out that the management of the lands is the key issue. The ownership might be required if we're going to better manage those lands.
If people want more information about this, specifically folks in your home state, to where can they turn, Fred?
They should go to a website, perc.org. There's a great report, Divided Lands. It compares federal and state management of public lands and shows the states are much better at it than the federal government.
Fred Birnbaum, the vice president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. We're glad your schedule was free and you were able to join us today to talk about land management by the feds in the sovereign state of Idaho. That's going to do it for us. Midpoint is up next at high noon. We will see you tomorrow, 9 o'clock in the east, 6 a.m. in the west. For now, stay brave, stay free, stay tuned, and thanks for watching.